Hi everyone, thank you for lasting this long. There's been, as you know, a lot of 20th century history today and yesterday, some of it involving La, and as he says himself, he spent the last 10 years in the 20th century, so he's going to speak on dueling, which I think mainly focuses on the 18th century, so it's a bit of a relief for some of us. I'm sure you all know, but La is curator of Irish military history at the National Museum, and actually created an exhibition about dueling in 2010. So, yes, it's a subject he's very familiar with, and I'll hand over to him.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. So what I'm going to do to talk about today is about dueling in Ireland in the Irish context. I have, as all presentations they say you should never do, I have video, I have a PowerPoint, and I have a real object. So if you behave and you listen to me throughout the whole talk, I'll let you touch the gun and play with the gun later on. You'll also notice I didn't bring two. I only brought one, just in case at the end of the conference some of the conference organisers want to kind of work out a few issues with themselves.
And some of ours.
What I do want to talk about, just quickly to put some sort of context, is the history of the National Museum's arms collections. We have a very large arms collection covering about 800 muskets and rifles, machine guns, about 600 of these handguns, and then a very large collection of swords. We're the only organisation in Ireland allowed to have these weapons under licence. Gun laws and sword laws in Ireland are very, very strict, and we come under the control of the Garda Commissioner, who has supervisory rights over our collection. So outside the army, the police and ourselves, you're not supposed to have any of this material. I'm then going to look at duelling with swords, and then duelling with pistols. With swords, very, very popular up to about the 1750s and then 1760s. Then pistols start to take over. And I'm really going to focus at it from an Irish point of view in the sense of the type of weapons that are being made in Ireland, because Ireland is a producer of weapons for the local market in swords and in pistols. And then I'm going to talk about duelling in Ireland, some of the rules and how things, some of the figures, and then look at some flamboyant fire eaters. Fire eaters was the nickname given to people who insisted on having duels every morning. And there's a good few of them are Irish in Ireland, but also a few in America with a family reference, which I want to bring into the talk. I'm also going to try and show you two films, which I'm not sure are going to work on this, but we can, if afterwards, you can look at them on the computer, and then a very short conclusion. So, this is the collection as it is in our armoury. We have a purpose-built armoury in Conn's Barracks, where all weapons are stored under tight security. And as I said, a vast collection of items. The highlights in the collection are 19th century weapons, in particular the War of Independence in 1916. So the weapons of all the famous people. We have Michael Collins' pistol, De Valera's pistol, several for Countess Markievicz, Porrick Pierce and others. We also then have a lot of duelling pistols and Irish-made weapons, and that's really what our collection is. Our weaknesses then will be weapons prior to 1780, mainly because they've been continuously used, and not many of them survived. And of course, Second World War, we just haven't gone into that area yet and started collecting World War II material. But we do have a very large exhibition dealing with Irish military history called Soldiers and Chiefs, where a lot of this material is on loan to us from the Irish Defence Forces. So, kind of highlights in the collection are blunderbusses. Ireland has a big industry making blunderbusses for house defence. These ones are for the Cork to Dublin Royal Mail Coach, and every Royal Mail Coach would have had two of these. Every barge boat had blunderbusses, and most large houses around Ireland would have had them. So they're a home defence, ideal for blasting away the attackers. You're not going to kill everybody with one shot, but what you do is you badly injure them. And all these weapons always have what they call a brass butt, which this is the part of the weapon called a butt, and once you fire your weapon you then turn it into a club and you smash the person over the head. Because to load this or reload something like this takes about 5 minutes. So the reality is all those movies that you've seen with people firing flintlock pistols at each other, that's not what happens. You fire once and then you try and beat somebody to death with your pistol or your blunderbuss.
Is a blunderbuss a shotgun?
It's bigger than a shotgun, so it's a very large bore. So when you fire, you're normally going to have it filled with maybe small musket balls. People think you can throw anything into it, but if you throw nuts and bolts into a blunderbuss, it will blow up on you. So what you do is normally a bag of balls, and when that blows, you get that kind of shotgun spread. But unlike a shotgun, these things will do damage to you if they hit you. The collection also has a very large collection of weapons brought back by Irishmen in the 19th century, which material we call in museum context ethnographical material. So you have material brought back, a grenade launcher brought back from Italy, after the great, one of the big visits there. And then on the right-hand side you have a Giselle, an Afghan-type gun, which anybody coming back from Afghanistan in 1879 or later would have brought back one of these as a kind of war trophy. And our collections are full of this material. And then you have the rare and exotic type of weapons. This is an air rifle designed by a company called Bates of London around 1775. So this is the height of technology in 18th century London, making an air rifle. The difference between a rifle and a musket is with a rifle you're able to have an aim shot, with a musket you don't. So this is somebody in 1775 creating a weapon that fires using air, and you'll normally get a shot out to about 50 or 60 metres, which in 1775 is quite amazing. So this is very much a rich man's toy. And then we also have a very large collection of captured German material. The museum had an exhibition on the Great War in 1919 after the war. So ironically we have more material relating to the Germans than we do to the Irish and the British Army. And that remained in our storerooms down the basement for most of the 20th century, as we weren't fully sure what to do with it. Of course, as Kevin and other people are talking about today, our approach to World War I has changed, and this material now is on display in Soldiers and Chiefs. And this is our interactive in our exhibition, which looks at the development of guns in the 19th century for Irish men serving the British Army, starting off with Waterloo with the Brown Bess, then moving on to the Martini Henry of the Zulu Wars, and then finally the Lee Enfield. So we actually allow our visitors to handle weapons and to use them and to kind of see how they work. And also, we also fired each weapon into ballistic soap to show you the impact of each of these weapons when they do actually hit you. So it's not a glorifying interactive, but it does give you a chance to handle weapons, which, as I say, is quite unusual in Ireland. So, dueling with swords. The problem with dueling with swords was if you came up against a swordsman who knew how to use a sword, it would normally last about 20 or 30 seconds, and it would be all over very, very quickly. That's one of the reasons why pistols take over. Many young men would have spent maybe 10 years practicing with swords. And the great fear was if you were called out for a duel, that you would go up against a sword master, and as I said, invariably it would be over very, very quickly. The Irish context, Reed are the big makers of swords. They're on Parliament Street. There was a pub there for many years called Reed's of Parliament Street that actually started off as Reed's Sword Company, and they only closed down in the 20th century, late 20th century. Eventually, when sword making went out of fashion in the 1820s, they moved on to making skates, ice skates, and surgical instruments. And as I say, kept in existence right on to the 20th century. And their main business is on Parliament Street. They moved from buildings up and down the street, which is just here. And as I say, they're in business for over almost 300 years. So quite an impressive organisation. And producing these weapons in Dublin for a very large market. As you can see with Trinity College and Dublin Castle, that's really the market for dueling swords during this period. What you do find, and I'll kind of make reference throughout the talk, is that alcohol has a lot to do with this dueling, in the sense that two friends go out for a night's drinking either in the British Army, in the barracks where I work today, Collins or Royals Barracks, or in Trinity College. You have a fight, and then suddenly at 6 o'clock in the morning you're trying to figure out what did you say to him has upset your friends so much that you're trying to kill each other in Phoenix Park. And that's essentially what happens continuously throughout the 18th century. This is a reed sword. It's a standard kind of dueling sword of the period. It's what a gentleman would have carried and been seen carrying around in Dublin. Again, as a gentleman, he's allowed to carry a sword. There are very strict rules about who and who cannot carry swords. And this is the type of sword that would have been used in a duel in Ireland in the 18th century. This is a standard heavy cavalry sword of the British Army, which again, Reed, all these swords are made by Reed, but they've made this one for an officer, again, following on from a design that the British Army has set down. Heavy swords or heavy cavalry are a different type of sword. When you're on a horse attacking on a heavy horse, you're normally attacking infantry in the open, so you have a very, very long blade because you need a long reach coming down from your horse. And this is, again, another dueling sword, but what's interesting about this one is that the whole hilt, what we call the area where the handle is, and the guard, is all made in solid Irish silver. So this weapon is worth about 30,000 euros, and at least half of that is actually based on its silver content. So the blade itself is steel, but the rest of it, everything else, is solid Irish silver. When we took this out of our collections, it was black, because silver will always discolour. It was only when we cleaned it up that we realised it was solid silver. And this is the light cavalry sword. Again, this one is made by Reed. And light cavalry swords are designed for light cavalrymen. Unlike the heavy horse who attack infantry, light cavalry normally attack other cavalrymen. So they need a lighter sword which they can bring over their head to attack another cavalryman. And that's why it's a different style. We probably use the term sabre to describe it. This one is a presentation sword. Reed, in particular, made a lot of presentation swords for officers, especially after 1798 and 1803. At that time, medals weren't given out for bravery. What you normally, if you carried out a brave act on the battlefield, you got a presentation sword. And that's really one of the main areas that Reed made a lot of money. So this one is finished off with gold and with silver. So again, given to a young officer for his contribution to putting down the 1803 rising. And this is the standard sword of the British Army, made by a company called Brady. So it's not just Reeves. Brady also makes swords in Dublin. They also make swords for the Order of St. Patrick. So that they're the next people to come along. And the Bradys and the Reeves would have been in competition throughout the 18th and early 19th century. This sword here is from Ballinamuk. It's one of the cavalry swords that was used in the final battle with the French forces. And again, it's based on the light cavalry that was used by the British Army throughout this period. And when they trained soldiers, it only took 2 years to train a soldier to use a cavalry sword, and also took about 2 years to train the horse. So it's a very expensive process to train up cavalry soldiers. They were also trained to attack by using this cutting method. If you can see it, maybe not in the full light, but on the right-hand side, each cut is worked out that you attacking a cavalryman on his horse. So you're slashing always around the face because you're trying to take out the eyes and blind your opponent, and then also trying to go for the neck. The idea is one good slash to the neck and the game is all over for the other person. And this is the 2 years that you spend. You spend your time on your horse learning how to attack in this kind of fashion. So when we look at dueling and pistols, and my slides are slightly slipping because of different format, these are all the companies that are making weapons in Ireland in this period, 1780 to 1820. So it's a very, very large industry, about 20 companies in total. There's also men and women doing this job. You find that where a gunsmith has died, his widow will take over the running of the company until her sons or somebody else can take over the company. So you have Eames, Elizabeth Eames and James Eames ran the same company. So as I said, it's a big industry. It's based in that area with the map I showed you between Parliament Street right over towards Trinity College, what we call today that lovely area of Temple Bar. But that is the main area for these kind of artisan companies making weapons and swords and also scientific instruments. The Rigby family then are the biggest gun makers in Dublin. They're based in and around Suffolk Street, where the bottom of Grafton Street. There are 3 generations. There's John Rigby, and then he goes into business with there's William Rigby, then there's William and John Rigby. There's John Rigby, then there's William Rigby and John Rigby. And then the final is John Rigby. Between the 3 generations, they produce a huge amount of weapons. John Rigby eventually closes down the company and moves it to England in the 1890s. He also becomes the inventor of the Lee Enfield rifle. He takes up a government job, designed the Lee Enfield rifle in the 1880s. And these 3 generations, as I say, have a huge output. And in America in particular, collectors want these type of weapons nowadays. And Rigby is a well-documented collection because the diaries and also the record keeping still exists. So you can learn exactly, if you have an original gun, exactly who owned it at the beginning and where it's been for the last couple of 100 years. So that adds to the kind of value of the guns. And this is the earliest Rigby piece that we have, which is from 1779. It's done by the John Rigby, probably as he was an apprentice piece because it's finished off with silver again. And in and around the firing mechanism, the firing area is actually finished off in gold, which is that area there. So this is a kind of showpiece that he would prepared for his apprenticeship. As I say, quite a lot of bling. So when we look at pistols at this stage, the kind of heyday of dueling is carried out with 2 types. The flintlock, which is the top, which relies on the flint of the stone to cause the explosion. And then you have the percussion, which is like a toy cap gun, introduces a cap which makes life a bit easier in Ireland, in particular with flintlock guns when you're firing, if it's raining or it's damp like it is today. The damp alone will affect the flintlock, and in many cases the weapon won't fire properly. So the percussion in 1810 was the next invention. It made shooting in damper conditions better. But it's really with the introduction of the revolver in the 1840s that you start to see shooting become more dangerous. And once the revolver is introduced, that's when dueling starts to kind of decline because it becomes more dangerous to stand in front of somebody with a gun. So there was more luck, if you like, with the early flintlocks and the early percussions. This one is a particular pair of pistols owned by O'Gorman Mahon from County Clare, who's also a very well-known jeweller. And these are two of his guns. They have what's called a sawback, which is a particular type of dueling gun. It almost looks like a saw, which is very popular around 1820. So stylistically, you're able to date all these pistols from 1850 up to 1820, because they all follow fashions. These are gentlemen who are keen to be seen with the latest and the best gun. And again, you can see finishing off in silver. Rigby's themselves in 1838 at a lecture in the Royal Dublin Society claimed that it was due to the accuracy in particular of the Rigby pistols that duelling had stopped in Ireland. And that's partly true. The other reasons are, of course, the introduction of the police force in 1822, who cut down on duelling in Ireland. The pistols do become more accurate. And then Queen Victoria in 1830 passes a law where she insists that British Army officers found fighting a duel will lose their commissions, and that kind of kills it off very quickly. No one wants to lose a commission over duel. It doesn't stop people, of course. They go to Paris and go to France, and dueling is quite popular in France right up into the 1870s. And there's occasions where British officers and also British politicians go to Paris to fight their duels, which they're allowed to as long as they're not on English soil. And this is John Rigby, the third generation. By the third generation, you're seeing a dramatic shift in what's happening. They're making a lot of rifles for shooting, in particular for hunting down in Africa and in India. But it's really just reselling of pistols which are now mass-produced around the world. After 1840, a gentleman called Samuel Colt starts to mass-produce revolvers, and he's able to produce 1 million guns or revolvers a year. And that destroys this local industry in Dublin because they can't compete with big American companies. And Colt also introduces something called interchangeability. Each gun that's made in Dublin is handmade, it's very delicate. If it gets damaged, it has to almost be rebuilt. Once you have something called interchangeability, the guns can be made, 1,000 guns can be made, they can be broken up, and you can still put them all back together and have 1,000 guns. So that's really the first time that we see that mass production scale, and it destroys the local industry in Ireland. And John, as I say, has to move the business then to London and eventually join the government to keep a weekly wage. We're going to try and play a video and see what happens.
Rather less romantic was the incident which led to this duel in 1803. The two protagonists, Naval Captain McNamara and Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery, an infantry officer, had quarrelled over a fight between their dogs. It was a trivial matter, but honour had to be satisfied.
Good evening, sir.
A man challenged to a duel could always apologise for the offence he had given, and Colonel Montgomery was given the opportunity to do so. But to anyone who valued his reputation as a man of honour, an apology was out of the question, and the only alternative was to fight.
The Colonel won't apologise. We have to proceed. I would suggest we do this. 6 paces.
It was the task of the seconds to arrange all the details of how the duel would be fought, and with what weapons. By the turn of the 18th century, swords were rarely employed in affairs of honour, and pistols were used more frequently. The weapons chosen were a matching pair of flintlock pistols, accurate and deadly at a much greater range than the short distance chosen for this duel. To ensure fair play, the seconds supervised each other in the loading of the pistols. As military men, Captain McNamara and Colonel Montgomery were both excellent shots, and each must have known that there was a strong likelihood of being killed. But even that was preferable to the dishonour of refusing a challenge.
Yes.
When the seconds were satisfied that all was in order, Captain McNamara and Colonel Montgomery began their final preparations. As well as being potentially lethal affairs, duels were also illegal, and yet two respected officers were prepared to risk their lives and reputations over a trifling matter. As an account of the time put it, they were notables who had passed through many a peril in their country's cause, full of merit and honour, and now, having lowered themselves by an unseemly squabble in public, they have resolved to break the laws of God and their country by fighting a duel on account of a quarrel for the sake of two vile dogs. As the challenger, Captain McNamara was entitled to choose his pistol first. This was no new experience for him. He had fought 2 or 3 duels before.
Gentlemen, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Both men were wounded in the duel. Colonel Montgomery was carried to a nearby house where he died 5 minutes later. Captain McNamara recovered and was tried for murder. Given glowing character references by Nelson amongst others, the captain told the jury, "When called upon to lead others into honourable danger, I must not be supposed to be a man who sought safety by submitting to what custom has taught others to consider as a disgrace." He was found not guilty.
So in Ireland, and I know the light's kind of coming up there, but in Ireland, the kind of golden era for duelling is in the 1640s, during the wars, the 11-year war then, and also during the 1690s, especially when King James gets to the throne, where there's a large amount of fighting and duels being fought. And then the kind of golden era, if you like, is after 1800, after the penal laws are overturned and Catholic gentlemen can now carry arms, and it kind of, well, it's starting to kind of die off in England. It kind of takes off again in Ireland and kind of goes on till 1820, while it reached a plateau in England. So they're kind of the 3 big areas of fighting. Of course, the first 2 would have been very much not with pistols but with swords, and then by 1800 everyone is buying their Rigby pistol and trying to kill their best friend. And this is a quote from Barrington in his autobiography. "It's incredible what a singular passion Irish gentlemen had for fighting each other, and the duel was considered a necessary piece of a young man's education. The first 2 questions always asked when he proposed for a lady wife were, what family is he of, and did he ever blaze?" So he had to prove that he was a gentleman, and that was the code. It was only gentlemen could fight a duel together, and if you didn't turn up to the duel, of course, you're no longer a gentleman. You're ostracised, and you couldn't get married because you would be seen then as having failed. So it's all about the turning up and being seen to receive the fire. You had to stand there and take it as the 2 officers you saw in the film clip, and prove that you were a gentleman and brave enough to receive the fire. Of course, to a 21st century audience, that's complete madness. But as I say, that was the mores of the day. And very strictly controlled. So the kind of Bible for dueling in Ireland is by Professor James Kelly from St. Patrick's, who wrote a book about 15 years ago called This Damn Thing Called Honour, where he actually went through all the newspapers from 1771 to 1810. And at the time, the local newspapers, especially in Dublin, the tabloid papers, there was a fixation with dueling. So every morning they'd kind of comment on what had happened in Phoenix Park, or the other popular places would have been around Clontarf. On beaches were very, very popular, because beaches were open spaces. There also had been a number of deaths of civilians in Phoenix Park, where people going to work, or even 2 schoolboys going to school, were accidentally shot when the 2 duelists fired at each other, missed, and balls went kind of flying and killed the kids. But what James did, or Jim worked out, was when he looked at the various types of arguments, insults was 69. So it's really, as I say, it's these kind of drunken arguments late at night where you insult your best friend and suddenly you have to go out. They become a big part of Irish politics. It was a way of getting rid of your opposite number in a local election. was 33. And then women come into it also. 19 duels in this period were over women, and then legal matters were 14. So kind of Jim breaks them down, each one, and showing different fights that they occur. So it's kind of everything in many ways that happens in our lives. But at those days, of course, it could end in a horrible duel. And then in a sample of 306 Irish duels fought in the 19 years between 1771 and 1790, Professor Kelly reported 65 instant deaths, 16 mortal wounds, which normally could linger on. The science or the surgery wasn't there. If you got anywhere in around the chest, it was a long, lingering death. If it was a leg or a hand, it was a chop. And that's what you always made sure your doctor or surgeon was with you. 94 where one man was injured and 24 with both. Out of the sample, less than a third ended bloodlessly. So if you were going to stand up, and you saw the pacing in the video, sometimes it was 12 paces between those two officers, but sometimes it could even be closer. It depended how much animosity there was between the two participants. And sometimes it could be at 6 feet, 7 feet, and at that distance you can't really miss. You also do find, and Professor Kelly found, that if there was a lot of animosity between the two parties, you both fired and you both missed, you might decide to load up again and go until actually somebody was shot. And there are occasions where four times they have to fire at each other before one of them is killed. As I say, to a modern audience, it's just madness. If you read any books on dueling, and there's probably a new book every 2 or 3 years, the Irish code is always thrown out. It's the only code that survives. That's why it gets quoted everywhere. It was created and written in Clonmel by a bunch of drunken lawyers, and it was based, or would be used by those lawyers when they were in Tipperary, Galway, Mayo, Sligo, Roscommon. In Galway it was known as the 26 Commandments. So it was a set of rules for having a duel, written in very archaic 18th century language. And we expect there were rules like this all over the country. This is the only one that it has remained. It's the only one that actually has remained in between England and Ireland. So in every dueling book or anything you see on YouTube, it's the one that gets thrown out. The one I like is that number 7 here. No apology can be received in any case after the parties have taken the ground without exchanges of fire. So once you turn up and you've loaded up, there's no backing down. And I'll talk about that in relation to a duel, a very famous duel in America. Sometimes people would fire in the air and say, I'm very sorry, I apologise. That stage is too late. In the Irish rules, if you turn up, you fire at each other and see what happens. And the challenge has the right to choose his own weapon. And this is important for what I was saying earlier on. Unless the challenger gives his honour that he is not a swordsman. So again, there was this fear that if you're up against somebody who knew how to use the sword properly, it was going to be over in about 30 seconds. So when we look at flamboyant fire eaters, probably the most famous one in Ireland is the politician Daniel O'Connell, who fought against a councilman called D'Estaire, a French Huguenot, over a dispute at City Hall. This is an unusual duel because it's fought actually in front of about 300 people. This is sort of like a grudge match that we've been building up over a couple of weeks. And it happens just outside Naas. So there's a lot of witnesses, which is very, very unusual for a duel. Sadly for D'Estaire, he had a second who actually never loaded a pistol before. So if you are fighting a duel later on, make sure you know what you're doing when you're loading the pistol. So his second, and the seconds, you never loaded your own pistols, loaded the pistol for D'Estaire. When he fired, the ball is said to have landed on O'Connell's foot, which is not a good idea. O'Connell had an Irishman who was in the French army load his pistols. Now, in his account, I've forgotten the name of the particular French officer, but he hated this man. But he had nominated him as his second because he knew how to load a pistol. And when D'Estaire fired, O'Connell then levelled his pistol and shot D'Estaire in the stomach, and it took him 12 hours to die. It was a very long, lingering death. But of course it made O'Connell. O'Connell becomes famous for fighting this duel. He wears a black glove, according to legend, for the rest of his life because he was so shocked by killing somebody, which of course is not true. He just sent out his eldest son to fight all his duels, which must have been tough on his eldest son. But his eldest son actually fought 4 of the duels on behalf of his father, because his father couldn't kill another man. Thanks, Dad. This is one that kind of resonates in my family. This is the duel in America in 1804 between Aaron Burr, who's Vice President of America, and Alexander Hamilton, who now has a musical and a movie about himself. Hamilton had been Secretary of Treasury and had various positions, had been a very famous revolutionary general, as had Burr. But they hated each other for about 30 years. If you have a chance to read Hamilton's the brilliant biography on Hamilton, their paths cross over a long time. So eventually they find themselves across from Manhattan in New Jersey. If you go there today, actually, it's a small little park that you can take a ferry across from Manhattan and find a little crest on marking the exact spot. Hamilton makes the mistake that he turns up and he fires his pistol into the air and he says, "I'm sorry for what I said about you, Aaron." Aaron decides to shoot Hamilton. And in doing so, he kills Hamilton very straight away. But in doing so, he destroys his career because it seems incredibly ungentlemanly for him to shoot Hamilton after Hamilton had apologised. But as you saw in the Irish code, to turn up with pistols and then at the last moment was a bit risky, and Hamilton was probably chancing his arm anyway. But Burr himself, his whole career is destroyed. He has to resign as vice president and eventually ends off dying in the Midwest trying to organise a revolution against the American government, as you do. The irony of ironies is that Hamilton's son had died at the exact same spot fighting a duel the previous year in 1803. And Irish and Irish, when I put on this exhibition in 2010, I was reminded by my good wife that she actually is a Burr and is related to Aaron Burr. So every now and then she'd like to take out the pistol and pistol make me. Coming back to Ireland, the Fighting Fitzgerald, this gentleman here on the left-hand side about to be killed and hung in London. His house is in Turlough Park, County Mayo, where ironically now the National Museum of Ireland has its Museum of Country Life. He fought 12 duels at the end of the 18th century. He was a notorious braggart who went around looking for fights. He would normally have duels with friends or people he had very large gambling debts with. For some reason, always happened, got into big money, and then suddenly he'd be shooting the person. And of course, once they were killed, the debts were written off. Eventually, anyway, the law caught up with him on the 12th duel, and he was executed for the 12th duel. But a very famous rake of the 18th century. And that's risky. It's the lights coming back up again. And they're the kind of three fire eaters. But hopefully I've given you a kind of crash course on how to fight duels. It's utter complete madness. There is a very strong Irish link in relation to the making of the weapons and then the fondness of fighting them in Ireland. And luckily, as I say, with the introduction of the police force in 1822, it starts to die off with also the accuracy of the pistols themselves. For those of you who've been very, very good for listening, if you want to put on a pair of gloves and you promise not to point the gun at me, you can play with the pistol. This is an early 1780s dueling pistol made by a company called Hutchinson, who were based in and around Collins Street. And really what to notice that from it's a flintlock pistol, is that the barrel on an Irish dueling pistol is 9 inches, and the one on an English pistol is, of course, 8 inches. So we had to have bigger guns because we're Irish. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Questions?
Yeah, it's not a question, but this memory came to me as you were speaking, and that's, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there was a movie starring most improbably Rock Hudson called Captain Lightfoot, and there was a duel scene filmed at Powersport Hall.
Okay, I didn't know that.
I've just looked it up, and I wasn't
But when
really,
is it looking
it
at?
is true. So I wonder if it'd be great to get a clip from that.
No, definitely.
What a scene that would be. But the Powersport World Cup, I don't even know, is it sometime in the 1960s or something?
I didn't know that one, actually. I have to find that one out and put it onto the talk.
Yeah, I seem to recall somebody saying that duels in Ireland were unusually lethal in comparison to abroad, suggesting that there were a lot of unknown duels going on that people weren't actually. If everything was comparable, Irish people are particularly prone to.
Well, definitely the gentleman class were prone to it. And there could have been, again, you're relying, looking back 200 years on the newspapers and what turns up in the newspapers. But there probably was a huge number of duels that go underreported. But I'd say, in particular in Dublin, outside Dublin, probably underreported. But in Dublin, there was a good number of newspapers, and they loved commenting on what had happened the night before. So, yes, please do.
Sorry.
So just, I mean, on that last point, as I understand it, the dueling convention in Russia was that it was to the death, and you would carry on reloading until you did. It's one of the there are several literary references to it as well. But what I was very interested by what you were saying about the shift from dueling with swords to dueling with pistols and this fear of coming up against somebody who's an expert.
Yep.
I had understood that the era when dueling was conducted predominantly by swords, actually fatalities and injuries were considerably fewer, because aside from the risk of coming up against somebody you didn't know was very good,
Yep.
and presumably in a relatively small society you'd have a fairly good knowledge of
Who saw him outside.
The business of, first of all, it's unlike being hit by a pistol ball
Yep.
where you're going to sustain a dangerous injury.
Yeah.
You know, you can be
People-
scratched or cut by a sword,
Yeah.
and eventually you're knackered after 5 minutes, and therefore you sort of
But
give up.
it's the speed. If you come against a master swordsman and they know what they're doing, you're going to go. It's not like fencing. They'll have you cut very, very quickly. What happens with swords is people do survive longer, but the injuries are horrific because you're looking at slashes to the face, to the body, and people do recover from that. But then septicemia can kind of come into it. So it's being disfigured is the big fear with the sword. You're actually, if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to come out. You might survive it. The film that I didn't want to show there is just the qualities with the light. But Sheridan, the famous Irish playwright, he fought 2 duels, and the first one ended in a draw, and then they came back and fought another 2 weeks later over a woman. And both men were very, very badly cut. So it's the disfiguration is also another issue. When it comes to fighting in England and Ireland with duels, it really is up to the seconds. There is codes, but it really is the 2 people that you nominate as your seconds. They work out. They're the referees. So as I say, it's whatever they decide. They decide who's going to load the pistols, which pistols are going to be used, and they referee the whole game. And as I say, it could be at 6 feet or 6 paces. It can be 12 paces. It can even be longer. And I should also make the point that everyone cheats. I mean, if you're up at dawn, you make sure the sun is behind you. You blind them. Fitzgerald, in particular, was notorious for fighting duels in the winter, and he'd wear a coat, and then he'd have a coat underneath that, and another coat. And rumours were he was also wearing chainmail, and every trick in the book that he would survive. So people do cheat, but the trick was not to be caught cheating. That was the main thing. I didn't know about the Russians. That'd be interesting about the Russians. Do you want to use? Just put on the gloves. Just because it's 200 years old, we ask you to put on the gloves.
Sorry, just 1 second. Lar, could
Yep.
you speak into the mic?
Yes, I will.
Question. Thank
Sure.
you. Sorry.
No, it's just very much a gentlemanly thing to do, I'm afraid. I've never come across, you never know, Russia maybe there might be an example, but not that I've come across in Ireland yet. France. As I say, the French went up to kind of the 1890s where it wasn't illegal, so they kept at it.
One of the issues was that one of the women had some kind of medical background, not better description, and she was aware that the fabric getting into wounds could cause septicemia and whatnot.
Yeah.
So they fought bare-chested
Okay.
swords, which would have been somewhat of a risky issue even in France at the time. And so all the seconds, everybody, they were also women.
Thank you very much. I should have to add that to the lecture. Thank you.
I wanted to check that one. Anyone else got a question? Over there?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you who would supply the pistols?
The pistols, it depends. Yeah.
Yeah, Challenger or
If you were challenging, it would be normally with your pistol. And again, the seconds, it doesn't happen. Sometimes the seconds would decide. But whichever pistols were used, if it was your pistols, you had a huge advantage over your opponent because as you're seeing that pistol being brought around, it's like going to a tailor. The pistol grip is actually measured to your hand. So straight away you have an advantage. And the other thing, of course, is that you've practiced on them a lot more. So there's a huge advantage. But it does really come down to the seconds, and they might decide. Also, somebody might lob in an objection and say we have to go and borrow somebody else's pistol to fire. We don't trust either party to use their pistols. The other way of cheating was you could have a rifle, what's called rifling. These have plain barrels, so that when you fire it, but what you did was you rifled maybe 2/3 of the barrel, which gave you a slight advantage in aiming the pistols. So you have to stick your finger right down and see if you can feel it. But in particular, pistols in London were notorious for having rifling on them, and you paid more money for them, and you made sure that no one else knew about it. Because if you were caught cheating, that was just as bad as not turning up. You were not gentlemen then.
when you had an affair, when they made you
No, the pairs is when you turn up the duel. One pistol's for you, one is for your opponent. Yeah. No, that was the set. So you didn't turn up and fire. But in Ireland, I'm sure I didn't come across one. But I'm sure sometimes people had two pistols each when they were firing each other. It depends how much antagonism there is between the two people.
Now, do you think that Conor McGregor will be successful in bringing it back to the spectator sport?
It's the next level up. I mean, it has to come back. It's just crying out for cable TV.
Arm them, I say, and let's get on with it.
That might be the next close on, John. Thank you very much. No, thank you so much. That was fascinating talk. And sorry about the light quality.
No,
we
sorry.
need to work on that for next year. Thank you everyone for coming. This is the penultimate event for the West Cork History Festival. Michael Dobbs is speaking on the arena about House of Cards. I'm sure there's some kind of parallels I could draw, but I'm not going to even try at this late stage.
Too long.
So thank you for coming, and if you're interested, to go and hear Michael Dobbs in the other venue. And thank you, Lara.
Thank you very much. Thank you.